You're still playing dress-up, I see. That's what my sister said when I walked into her dining room in my service uniform. She laughed, her wine glass catching the chandelier light, completely unaware that the man sitting across from her, her own husband, had just gone pale. Because he knew something she didn't. He knew exactly who I was and what that uniform actually meant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Embossed cardstock in a cream envelope that screamed expensive taste. My sister Vanessa had always been particular about presentation, about making sure everyone knew she had ascended to a certain level of sophistication that the rest of our family had supposedly failed to reach. The invitation requested the pleasure of my company at an intimate dinner party, celebrating her husband's promotion to senior partner at his law firm. Dress code was listed as formal attire, and there was a handwritten note at the bottom in Vanessa's precise cursive asking me to please try to look presentable for once. I had stared at that note for a long time, feeling the familiar sting of her casual cruelty dressed up as sisterly concern. Vanessa had perfected this approach over the years, delivering insults with such polished sweetness that calling them out made you seem overly sensitive or unable to take a joke. Our mother had always defended her, saying that Vanessa just had high standards and I shouldn't take everything so personally. But there was nothing impersonal about spending your entire childhood being compared unfavorably to a sister who seemed to excel at everything that mattered to our parents. Academic achievement at prestigious schools, marriage to a successful professional, a beautiful home in the right neighborhood, membership in the right clubs. The contrast between us had been drawn early and reinforced constantly. Vanessa was the daughter who made our parents proud at cocktail parties and holiday gatherings. I was the daughter they struggled to explain, the one whose choices seemed perpetually disappointing or at least perplexing to their social circle. When I had announced at 18 that I was enlisting in the military instead of attending the university they had selected for me, the disappointment in our family home had been palpable and enduring. My father had actually asked me if I was trying to embarrass him, as if my decision to serve my country was somehow a personal attack on his reputation. Vanessa had been 22 at the time, already in law school, already dating Marcus Chen, the man who would become her husband. She had taken me aside the night before I left for basic training and asked me, with what seemed like genuine confusion, why I would choose such a hard and limiting path when I could have done something more respectable. She made military service sound like a fallback option for people without better choices, rather than a calling that required dedication and sacrifice. I tried to explain that I wanted to be part of something larger than myself, that I felt drawn to service and structure and the opportunity to lead and protect. She had smiled indulgently and patted my hand, the way you might comfort a child who insists they want to be an astronaut, and told me she hoped I would figure out what I really wanted to do with my life once I got this phase out of my system. That conversation had occurred 22 years ago. I was now 40 years old, and my military career was not a phase I had worked through but rather the defining commitment of my adult life. Yet in all those years, Vanessa had never really updated her perception of what I did or who I had become. To her, I was still the wayward younger sister who had made the eccentric choice to join the military instead of pursuing a proper professional career. Our interactions over the decades had been sporadic and surface level, primarily occurring at obligatory family gatherings where she would ask vague questions about whether I was still in the army, and I would give equally vague answers, having learned that detailed explanations of my work were met with polite disinterest. The truth was that I had spent the past 2 decades building a career that had taken me to 13 different countries, through multiple combat deployments, and up through the ranks in a field that few people truly understood unless they had lived it themselves. I had led soldiers through impossible situations, made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, earned commendations and recognition from peers whose respect meant everything to me. I had also sacrificed enormously for this career. I had no husband, no children, no permanent home filled with the kind of comfortable domesticity that Vanessa had accumulated. My relationships had been brief and ultimately incompatible with the demands of military life. My possessions fit in a small storage unit because I had spent more time living in temporary quarters on various bases than I had in any place I could call my own. These sacrifices had sometimes felt heavy, particularly during the lonely hours in far-flung locations when I wondered what my life might have looked like had I made different choices. But I had never regretted my path, Never felt that I had wasted my time or potential. The work mattered, the people I served with mattered, and the gradual accumulation of experience and responsibility had shaped me into someone I respected, even if my family struggled to understand or value what I had become. The current assignment that had brought me back to the States was temporary, a 2-year posting at the Pentagon that represented a significant step in my career progression. I was serving as a senior advisor on international military cooperation, working directly with allied nations on strategic initiatives that required both operational experience and diplomatic skill. The position had come with a promotion that I had learned about 6 months earlier, shortly after Vanessa's invitation had arrived. I had been named a full colonel, a rank that carried significant weight and responsibility. In the military hierarchy, colonel represents the senior field grade officer rank, typically commanding large units or serving in crucial staff positions. Approximately 1% of military officers reach this level. It was an achievement that had required decades of dedicated service, consistent excellence, and the respect of those who understood what such advancement actually meant. I had not mentioned my promotion to my family. This omission was partly practical, as I had been deployed when the promotion was officially announced and had not been in regular contact with anyone back home. But it was also partly protective, a decision rooted in the exhaustion of trying to make people who fundamentally did not value military service understand why this achievement mattered. I could imagine the conversation with my mother, who would congratulate me politely before asking when I thought I might finally settle down and have a normal life. I could imagine Vanessa's response, likely something patronizing about how nice it was that I was moving up in my chosen field, delivered with the subtle implication that moving up in the military was less impressive than advancement in civilian professional sectors that she actually respected. So when the invitation arrived, I made a decision that felt both defiant and deeply necessary. I would attend Vanessa's dinner party, I would wear my dress uniform rather than attempting to find formal civilian clothing, and I would allow whatever happened to simply unfold without trying to manage or minimize my own identity to make others more comfortable. The dress uniform would make my rank visible to anyone who understood military insignia. The eagles on my shoulders that denoted colonel would be clearly displayed, as would the ribbons representing various awards and deployments accumulated over more than 2 decades of service. If people were curious, I would answer their questions honestly. If they were not curious, I would not force explanations on an uninterested audience. The decision felt risky because I knew it might create awkwardness or conflict. Vanessa had been specific about wanting formal attire, and I suspected she had envisioned her guests arriving in cocktail dresses and well-tailored suits, projecting a certain aesthetic of sophisticated civilian success. My uniform would stand out, would mark me as different, would potentially make her uncomfortable in front of the people she was trying to impress with this carefully orchestrated dinner party. Part of me recognized that wearing the uniform was a quiet act of rebellion against a lifetime of being made to feel that my choices were somehow lesser or embarrassing. But a larger part of me simply felt that I had earned the right to show up as exactly who I was, without apology or accommodation. The drive to Vanessa's home took me through neighborhoods that grew progressively more expensive, houses getting larger and more architecturally distinctive, as I moved deeper into the area where successful professionals clustered. Her home was in a development called Sterling Oaks, where houses sat on 2-acre lots and homeowners association rules dictated everything from fence height to acceptable mailbox styles. I had been to her house only a handful of times over the years, always feeling vaguely uncomfortable in the pristine spaces that seemed designed more for display than actual living. Vanessa and Marcus had no children despite being married for 18 years, a circumstance that Vanessa attributed to their focus on careers and lifestyle choices that she presented as sophisticated and intentional, though I sometimes wondered if there was grief hidden beneath her certainty. I pulled into their circular driveway behind several other expensive vehicles, noting the catering van parked discreetly near the garage. Vanessa had hired professionals for this event, which meant the dinner would be elaborate and carefully staged. I sat in my car for a moment, checking my appearance in the rearview mirror. The uniform was impeccable because military standards allowed for nothing less. My hair was pulled back in the regulation style that I could achieve without thinking after decades of practice. The ribbons on my chest represented deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, multinational training operations, humanitarian missions, and various commendations including a Bronze Star that had come with a story I rarely told because civilians generally did not understand the context that made such awards meaningful. As I approached the front door, I could hear conversation and laughter filtering through the expensive windows. I rang the doorbell, which played a melodic chime that somehow managed to sound pretentious. Marcus answered, looking polished in a dark suit with a silk tie. His expression when he saw me was difficult to read, surprise mixed with something else I could not quite identify. He had always been cordial to me during our limited interactions, though we had never developed any real relationship beyond the bare minimum required by his marriage to my sister. "Elena," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "please come in. Vanessa is just finishing up with the caterers." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stepped into the foyer, which featured the kind of marble flooring and dramatic staircase that belonged in design magazines. Through the arched doorway to my left, I could see into the living room where several people were gathered holding wine glasses and engaging in the kind of animated conversation that happens at cocktail hour. Marcus seemed to hesitate, as if he wanted to say something but could not quite figure out how to begin. Before he could formulate whatever thought was troubling him, Vanessa appeared from the direction of the kitchen, her expression bright with hostess cheerfulness that faltered slightly when she saw me. She was wearing a cocktail dress in deep emerald that probably cost more than my entire month's clothing budget, her hair styled in loose waves that had certainly required professional attention. At 44, she maintained the kind of polished appearance that required significant time and financial investment, regular salon appointments and dermatology treatments and personal training sessions. She looked beautiful in the very specific way that her social circle valued, projecting success and control and effortless sophistication, even though I knew the effort behind such appearances was anything but effortless. Her eyes traveled over my uniform, taking in the ribbons and insignia with an expression that flickered between confusion and something that might have been embarrassment. Then she smiled, the bright social smile she used when trying to maintain composure, and delivered the line that would become the pivot point for everything that followed. "You're still playing dress-up, I see." The words landed in the foyer with deceptive lightness, delivered in a tone that suggested she was making a joke we both understood. Several of the guests in the living room had turned at the sound of her voice, their attention now focused on the entrance where I stood in full military dress uniform. I felt the familiar heat of humiliation beginning to rise, the old pattern of Vanessa diminishing me in front of others with comments disguised as humor. She laughed, a practiced sound designed to signal to everyone present that this was all in good fun, that I should not be offended by her characterization of my military service as playing dress-up. But then Marcus made a sound, something between a cough and a sharp intake of breath. I watched his face change as he looked at my uniform more carefully, his eyes moving from my face to the insignia on my shoulders. The color drained from his complexion in a way that was almost comical, his expression shifting from social politeness to something approaching shock. He took a step closer to me, his voice emerging strained and uncertain. "Those are eagles," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "You're a colonel?" The question hung in the air of that expensive foyer, and I watched Vanessa's expression change as she registered that something significant was happening that she did not understand. Her smile became uncertain, her gaze moving between Marcus and me as she tried to determine why her husband suddenly looked like he had seen a ghost. The guests in the living room had gone quiet, sensing drama or confusion that disrupted the carefully planned flow of the cocktail hour. I met Marcus's eyes and saw genuine respect there, mixed with disbelief. He understood what my rank meant in a way that Vanessa clearly did not, understood that the insignia on my shoulders represented a level of achievement and responsibility that contradicted every dismissive thing Vanessa had ever said about my career choice. I felt something shift inside me, a decision forming about how I would respond to this moment, and what I would allow to continue unchallenged. "Yes," I said simply, my voice carrying the quiet authority that came naturally after years of command. "I'm a full colonel. I was promoted 6 months ago." Vanessa laughed again, but this time the sound was nervous rather than dismissive. She waved her hand in a gesture that seemed designed to minimize whatever significance Marcus was apparently attaching to this information. She clearly wanted to move past this awkward moment and return to the dinner party she had carefully orchestrated, where she controlled the narrative and I played my assigned role, as the slightly disappointing younger sister, whose life choices were puzzling but ultimately irrelevant to the important people gathered in her living room. "Well, that's nice," she said, her tone suggesting she was talking about a hobby rather than a military rank. "I'm sure that's very exciting for you. Marcus, darling, we should really get everyone seated for dinner. The first course will be ready in just a few minutes." But Marcus was not moving. He was staring at me with an intensity that made Vanessa visibly uncomfortable, his professional legal mind clearly processing information and reaching conclusions that surprised him. He had spent his entire career evaluating people and situations, and I could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about his wife's younger sister. The other guests were beginning to drift toward the foyer, curious about whatever interaction was creating this unusual tension. "Vanessa," Marcus said slowly, his eyes still on me, "do you actually understand what Colonel means? Do you have any idea what your sister has accomplished?" The question was asked gently, but there was something underneath it that sounded like disappointment or even anger. Vanessa's face flushed, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the unexpected scrutiny. She attempted another laugh, but it came out strained and uncertain. "Of course I know what it means," she said defensively. "It's a rank. Elena's always been very dedicated to her military career, and I'm sure she's done well. But Marcus, our guests are waiting and I really think we should—" "She's in charge of hundreds of soldiers," Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on a sharp edge I had never heard from him before. "She's probably been in combat. She's advising on national security issues. Colonel is not just doing well, Vanessa. It's extraordinary. Less than 1% of military officers reach that rank. Your sister is a senior military leader, and you just made a joke about her playing dress-up." The silence that followed his words was absolute. Every person in that foyer and the adjacent living room was now fully focused on this unfolding confrontation. I saw several of the guests looking at my uniform with new attention, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to something approaching respect or even awe. Vanessa's face had gone from flushed to pale, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for something to say that would restore her control over the situation. I felt a strange mixture of emotions washing through me. There was vindication in having someone finally articulate what my achievements actually meant, particularly someone from Vanessa's own world who understood professional success in terms she respected. There was also sadness, a deep grief for all the years I had allowed her dismissiveness to make me feel small or apologetic about the life I had chosen. And underneath everything was anger, clean and clarifying, at the realization that I had participated in my own diminishment by not demanding that my family see and respect who I had actually become. One of the guests stepped forward, an older man with silver hair and an American flag pin on his lapel. His eyes were fixed on the ribbons on my chest, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that commanded attention. "That's a Bronze Star," he said, pointing to one of the ribbons, "and those are combat deployments. Iraq and Afghanistan if I'm reading correctly. Colonel, thank you for your service. It's an honor to meet you." He extended his hand, and I shook it, recognizing in his bearing and the way he had read my ribbons that he was a veteran himself, probably from an earlier generation. Several other guests moved forward, introducing themselves, asking questions about where I was stationed and what my current assignment entailed. The dinner party that Vanessa had carefully choreographed was dissolving into something she had not planned, with the focus shifting to me and my uniform in a way that clearly disturbed her sense of how the evening should unfold. Marcus was watching his wife with an expression that troubled me even in my moment of unexpected recognition. He looked disappointed in her, perhaps even ashamed, seeing her through eyes that had suddenly focused on a character flaw he had previously overlooked or not noticed. Vanessa seemed to sense his changed perception, her discomfort growing more visible as she struggled to regain control of the situation and her husband's approval. "I think we should go ahead and be seated," she announced, her voice higher and tighter than usual. "The caterers will be bringing out the first course, and I would hate for all their hard work to be wasted because we got distracted." The word "distracted" seemed to encompass me and my uniform and the unwanted attention that had disrupted her carefully planned evening. But the guests were not moving toward the dining room with the obedient promptness she clearly expected. They were still asking me questions, talking about their own military connections or their gratitude for service members, treating me with a respect that was both gratifying and deeply uncomfortable because it was so unfamiliar coming from people in Vanessa's social sphere. Eventually, we did move toward the dining room, where Vanessa had set a table that looked like something from a magazine spread. China and crystal and elaborate floral centerpieces created a setting designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. I found myself seated not in some peripheral position as I might have expected but rather near the center of the table, with Marcus at the head and several guests who seemed genuinely interested in talking to me on either side. Vanessa was at the opposite end, her hostess position physically separated from the conversation that increasingly centered around my military experience and current work. As courses were served by efficient catering staff, I found myself answering questions about military life, about deployment experiences, about the challenges of serving as a woman in a predominantly male field. Some questions were thoughtful and genuinely curious. Others reflected the kinds of misconceptions that civilians often held about military service. I tried to answer honestly without being preachy, describing the complexity and difficulty of the work, while also conveying what made it meaningful and worth the sacrifices required. Marcus participated actively in the conversation, asking informed questions that revealed he had more knowledge about military structure and operations than I would have expected. At one point, he mentioned that his firm did some pro bono work with veterans organizations, helping service members navigate legal issues related to benefits and discharge status. He spoke with genuine respect about the challenges military families faced and the inadequacy of support systems for those transitioning to civilian life. I found myself warming to him in a way I never had during our previous superficial interactions, seeing a depth and genuine care that had been invisible during brief holiday encounters. Vanessa grew quieter as dinner progressed, her initial attempts to redirect conversation away from military topics gradually abandoned. She picked at her food, her carefully applied makeup unable to disguise the tension in her face and the hurt in her eyes. I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and guilt watching her discomfort. Part of me wanted her to feel the weight of her years of dismissiveness, to understand how her casual cruelty had affected me. But another part of me, the part that still remembered being children together before the comparisons and competitions began, felt sad that this moment of recognition had to come at her expense. Toward the end of the main course, one of the guests, a woman who had been mostly quiet during the earlier conversation, asked me directly about my Bronze Star. She wanted to know what I had done to earn it, her question carrying genuine curiosity rather than the voyeuristic interest that sometimes accompanied inquiries about combat decorations. I hesitated, uncomfortable with making myself the center of attention in a way that felt like showing off or demanding recognition. But Marcus encouraged me to share the story, and I saw several other guests leaning forward with interest. So I told them, choosing my words carefully, about a mission in Afghanistan where my unit had been providing security for a humanitarian supply convoy traveling through a contested region. We had encountered an ambush, a coordinated attack that had disabled our lead vehicle and pinned down civilian aid workers in the kill zone. I had made the decision to extract the civilians under fire, organizing a defensive position while evacuating wounded personnel and coordinating air support. The action had lasted less than 30 minutes but had felt infinitely longer, every second filled with the weight of decisions that would determine whether people lived or died. We had gotten everyone out, though several soldiers had been wounded and our interpreter, a young Afghan man who had worked with us for 2 years, had been killed covering our withdrawal. The table was silent when I finished speaking. Several people had tears in their eyes. The veteran who had first recognized my ribbons nodded slowly, his expression conveying understanding that needed no words. Marcus was looking at me with something approaching wonder, as if he was seeing me for the first time and struggling to reconcile this person with the woman he had known only as his wife's somewhat awkward younger sister. When I glanced down the table toward Vanessa, I found her staring at her plate, her face pale and her jaw tight. She looked small somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical stature, and everything to do with the collapse of a worldview she had maintained for decades. In that moment, I understood that she was confronting the reality that she had fundamentally misjudged me, that her dismissive attitude toward my military service had been based on ignorance rather than informed evaluation. The recognition seemed to pain her in ways that went beyond simple embarrassment. The dinner concluded with dessert and coffee served in the living room, conversation gradually shifting to other topics, as the intensity of the earlier revelations gave way to more typical social interaction. Several guests sought me out individually to thank me again for my service or to share their own connections to the military, family members who had served or friends who had deployed. The respect and interest felt overwhelming after so many years of having my career treated as a peculiar choice that polite people did not discuss in detail. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, I found myself alone in the foyer with Marcus while Vanessa saw other visitors to the door. He looked at me with an expression that mixed respect and regret, struggling to articulate something that clearly mattered to him. "I owe you an apology," he finally said, his voice quiet enough that Vanessa would not overhear from the doorway where she was bidding farewell to the last departing couple. "I've known you for 18 years, and I never bothered to really understand what you do, or who you are. I just accepted Vanessa's characterization of your career as some kind of prolonged rebellious phase, and I never questioned whether that narrative was fair or accurate. Watching tonight, hearing you speak about your work, I'm ashamed that it took this long for me to see you clearly." His honesty was unexpected and disarming. I had prepared myself for conflict or awkwardness, but not for this kind of genuine contrition from someone I had always assumed shared Vanessa's dismissive view of my choices. I found myself uncertain how to respond, years of defensive posturing making it difficult to simply accept his apology without qualification or deflection. "You couldn't have known," I offered, trying to give him an exit from his obvious discomfort. "I don't talk much about my work with family, and Vanessa and I have had a complicated relationship for a long time. The distance between us is not entirely her fault." Marcus shook his head firmly, rejecting my attempt to minimize his accountability. "That's generous, but it's not accurate. I could have asked questions. I could have been curious. Instead, I was comfortable with a narrative that made you seem less accomplished because it supported my wife's need to feel superior. That says something about me that I'm not proud of." Before I could respond, Vanessa returned from the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in a way that took visible effort to maintain. She looked between Marcus and me, clearly aware that we had been having a private conversation and uncertain about its content. An awkward silence stretched out, filled with unspoken tensions and the weight of revelations that had reshaped the evening she had so carefully planned. "Well," she said finally, her voice artificially bright, "I suppose the dinner was successful, even if it didn't quite go as I expected. Thank you for coming, Elena. It was good to see you." The dismissal was polite but clear. She wanted me to leave, wanted the evening to end so she could process what had happened without the discomfort of my continued presence. Part of me wanted to confront her directly about her dress-up comment and her years of dismissiveness, to have the kind of honest conversation that might actually address the broken relationship between us. But I was suddenly exhausted, drained by the emotional intensity of the evening and the decades of hurt that I had carried without fully acknowledging. "Thank you for having me," I replied, matching her formal tone. "The dinner was lovely." I retrieved my coat and headed for the door, Marcus accompanying me with a warmth that contrasted sharply with Vanessa's cool politeness. At the threshold, I paused and looked back at my sister, who stood in her beautiful foyer in her expensive dress, looking somehow lost in her own carefully curated space. "Vanessa," I said, my voice gentle despite the anger and hurt I still felt. "I've spent 22 years building a career that matters to me. I've led soldiers, saved lives, served my country in ways that most people will never understand or appreciate. I don't need your approval or recognition to know my life has value and purpose. But I do need you to know that your casual dismissiveness over the years has hurt me more than you probably realize. That dress-up comment tonight was not a joke. It was cruel. And I won't accept that kind of treatment anymore. Not from you or anyone else." Her face crumbled, tears welling in her eyes as my words stripped away her defensive politeness. She opened her mouth to respond but seemed unable to form words, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering under the weight of truth spoken plainly. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder, a gesture that offered support while also somehow acknowledging the validity of my statement. I left then, walking to my car through the cool evening air, feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier than when I had arrived. The drive back to my temporary housing gave me time to process the evening, to examine the complex tangle of emotions that the unexpected confrontation had unleashed. There was satisfaction in finally being seen clearly by people who had dismissed me for so long. There was also sadness for the relationship with my sister that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding, and the hierarchy of values that our family had imposed on us both. When I finally arrived home and changed out of my uniform, hanging it carefully in my closet where the insignia gleamed in the dim light, I felt something shift inside me. The evening had been uncomfortable and confrontational in ways I had not fully anticipated. But it had also been necessary, a moment when I had finally refused to participate in my own diminishment. Whether it would change anything between Vanessa and me remained uncertain, but I knew with absolute clarity that I had changed, that I would no longer accept being made small by people who could not or would not understand the value of what I had built with my life. The uniform hanging in my closet represented more than rank or achievement. It represented a choice I had made as a young woman to dedicate my life to service larger than myself, to accept hardship and sacrifice in pursuit of purpose and meaning. That choice had cost me things I sometimes grieved, but it had also given me a sense of identity and accomplishment that was mine alone, earned through decades of dedication and perseverance. No dismissive comment or family disapproval could diminish what I knew in my bones to be true about the worth of my service, and the person that service had forged me into becoming. As I lay in bed that night, replaying the evening's events, I thought about the moment when Marcus had asked if I was a colonel, the shock and respect in his voice when he understood what my rank actually meant. That moment had changed something fundamental, not just in his perception but in my willingness to demand recognition for who I actually was rather than accepting whatever diminished version others found more comfortable. The change felt permanent, a line crossed that would affect every future interaction with family members who had grown accustomed to my silence and accommodation. Tomorrow I would return to work at the Pentagon, to meetings and strategic planning sessions that required every bit of experience and capability I had accumulated over 2 decades of service. My colleagues there understood what I did and respected the rank on my shoulders without needing explanation or justification. But tonight had been about something different, about claiming respect and recognition in spaces where those things had been consistently withheld. It had been uncomfortable and painful and absolutely necessary, and as I finally drifted toward sleep, I felt something I had not experienced in relation to my family for many years. I felt hope that perhaps finally, they might begin to see me as I actually was rather than as the disappointing younger sister whose life choices they could not understand or value. The morning after the dinner party arrived with the kind of clarity that follows emotional storms, when everything feels sharper and more defined than it did in the chaos of the moment. I woke early out of habit, the internal clock that had been reset countless times across different time zones and deployment schedules pulling me from sleep before dawn. The apartment provided by the military for my Pentagon assignment was functional but impersonal, the kind of temporary housing that never quite becomes home no matter how long you occupy it. I went through my morning routine with the automatic precision that years of military discipline had ingrained, each action completed in the same sequence it had been performed thousands of times before. As I dressed in my utility uniform for the workday ahead, I found myself thinking about the expression on Vanessa's face when I had delivered my final statement before leaving her home. The carefully maintained composure that had defined her entire adult life had cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. Part of me felt guilty for causing her that pain, the remnant of a younger self who had always tried to smooth over conflicts and make herself smaller to avoid family tension. But a larger part of me recognized that the pain she experienced was not something I had inflicted unfairly, but rather the natural consequence of her own actions finally being named and challenged after years of going unchecked. My phone had remained silent overnight. No messages from Vanessa or Marcus, no follow-up communications attempting to process or explain what had transpired. The silence felt heavy with unresolved tension, but I was not ready to break it myself. I had said what needed to be said, drawn the boundary that should have been established decades earlier. Whatever came next would need to originate from Vanessa if there was to be any genuine movement toward understanding or reconciliation. I could not continue doing the emotional work of maintaining a relationship with someone who fundamentally dismissed my life and choices. The drive to the Pentagon took me through the familiar traffic patterns of the Washington metropolitan area, thousands of people moving toward their various obligations in the machinery of government and military operations. I had been working at this assignment for 4 months now, long enough to establish routines but not so long that the weight of the responsibility had become entirely comfortable. My role involved coordinating with military representatives from allied nations on joint training exercises and strategic initiatives, work that required diplomatic skill alongside military expertise. The meetings often involved sensitive discussions about capabilities and commitments, finding common ground between nations with different priorities and political pressures. Today's schedule included a briefing with senior officials about an upcoming multinational exercise involving forces from 7 different countries. I had spent weeks coordinating the planning, navigating the complex logistics of bringing together military units with different equipment, procedures, and languages to accomplish shared objectives. The work was intellectually demanding and politically delicate, requiring constant attention to details that could derail months of preparation if handled poorly. It was exactly the kind of challenge that energized me, that reminded me why I had dedicated my life to service even when that dedication came at significant personal cost. As I settled into my office and began reviewing briefing materials, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The name on the screen made me pause. It was from my mother, something that rarely happened outside of birthday acknowledgments or holiday coordination. She was not someone who communicated frequently through text, preferring phone calls for anything of substance. The message was brief and characteristically indirect. "Vanessa called me this morning. She was very upset about something that happened at her dinner party. She said you embarrassed her in front of her guests. I'm sure there are 2 sides to this story, but I hope you'll consider reaching out to apologize. Family harmony is important, Elena." I read the message 3 times, feeling the familiar frustration of my mother's reflexive positioning of me as the one responsible for family disharmony. The assumption that I owed Vanessa an apology without any inquiry into what had actually occurred reflected a pattern that had shaped our family dynamics for as long as I could remember. Vanessa was the daughter whose feelings and comfort took priority, whose version of events was accepted as authoritative. I was the daughter expected to accommodate and apologize, to smooth over tensions even when I was the one who had been hurt. The impulse to respond immediately with a detailed explanation of what had actually transpired was strong, but I resisted it. Experience had taught me that defending myself to my mother rarely changed her fundamental positioning of family conflicts. She would listen to my explanation, and then gently suggest that I was being too sensitive or misinterpreting Vanessa's intentions. The emotional labor of trying to make her understand why her reflexive defense of Vanessa was hurtful felt overwhelming in that moment, particularly when I needed to focus on the complex briefing ahead. I set the phone aside and returned my attention to the briefing materials, forcing myself to engage with the strategic questions and logistical challenges that required my immediate focus. The ability to compartmentalize, to set aside personal emotional turmoil and perform professional responsibilities with full attention and capability, was a skill I had developed through years of military service. There had been deployments where personal crises at home had to be mentally shelved, while leading soldiers through dangerous operations. There had been moments of profound grief or fear that had to be contained and processed later, because immediate circumstances demanded clear thinking and decisive action. The briefing went well. My presentation of the multinational exercise plan received with approval, and only minor questions about specific coordination details. The senior officials in attendance recognized the complexity of bringing together diverse military forces and expressed confidence in the planning team's ability to execute successfully. As the meeting concluded and participants filed out, one of the generals paused beside my chair and leaned down to speak quietly. "That was solid work, Colonel. The level of detail and the anticipation of potential friction points shows real understanding of coalition operations. Your deployment experience is evident in how you've structured this exercise." The recognition from someone at that level of command was gratifying in a way that family acknowledgement had never been. This general understood exactly what the work entailed, what challenges had to be navigated, what expertise was required to coordinate operations across national boundaries and organizational cultures. His praise was informed and specific, grounded in shared professional knowledge, rather than vague social politeness. I thanked him and felt the satisfaction of knowing that in this environment, my contributions were understood and valued on their actual merits. After the briefing, I returned to my office to find an email waiting from an address I did not immediately recognize. The subject line read simply, "Thank you from last night. Opening it revealed a message from the older veteran who had first recognized my Bronze Star at Vanessa's dinner party. He identified himself as Robert Harrison, a retired Army officer who had served in Vietnam and later worked in defense contracting. His email was thoughtful and warm, expressing appreciation for my service and reflecting on the conversation we had shared about deployment experiences. Near the end of his message, he included a paragraph that struck me with unexpected force. "I hope you'll forgive an old soldier for offering unsolicited perspective, but I felt compelled to say this. Watching the interaction between you and your sister last night, I recognized something painfully familiar. I spent years trying to make my civilian family understand the significance of my military service, hoping they would value what I had done and who I had become through that service. It took me far too long to accept that their lack of understanding said nothing about the worth of my service and everything about their limited frame of reference. The respect of those who understand, of fellow service members and veterans who share the experience, that is the recognition that matters. Your sister may never fully appreciate what you've accomplished, and that is her loss, not a reflection of any inadequacy in you or your choices. You wear that uniform with honor, Colonel. That is what matters." I read his words multiple times, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for longer than I could remember. He had articulated something I had struggled to name: the futility of seeking validation from people whose frame of reference simply did not encompass the realities of military service. My family's inability to value my career was not evidence that my career lacked value. It was evidence that they measured success and meaning through a narrow lens that could not accommodate different forms of contribution and achievement. I composed a response thanking him for his message and his service, acknowledging that his perspective resonated deeply. Writing to him felt easier than contemplating how to respond to my mother's text message, which still sat unanswered on my phone. The contrast between these two communications illustrated the divide I was struggling to navigate. Robert Harrison, a virtual stranger, offered understanding and respect based on shared experience and knowledge. My mother, who had known me my entire life, offered conditional support dependent on my willingness to prioritize my sister's comfort over my own dignity. By lunchtime, my phone showed 3 missed calls from Vanessa. She had not left voicemails, but the persistence of the attempts suggested she wanted to talk with some urgency. I debated whether to return the calls or maintain the space I had claimed by leaving her home the previous night. The part of me that had been trained in conflict resolution and diplomatic negotiation recognized that avoiding communication indefinitely would not serve any productive purpose. But the part of me that was still processing decades of accumulated hurt was not ready for a conversation that would likely involve Vanessa, attempting to reframe what had happened in a way that minimized her responsibility. I decided to respond via text message rather than calling back, maintaining some control over the terms of engagement. "I saw that you called. I'm at work and not available to talk at length right now. If there's something specific you need to communicate, you can send a message." The response was deliberately neutral and boundaried, neither inviting extended conversation nor completely refusing contact. It arrived within minutes, a longer message than Vanessa typically sent. "Elena, I've been up all night thinking about what happened. I'm mortified by what I said when you arrived. The dress-up comment was thoughtless and hurtful, and I'm sorry. Marcus has been very upset with me, helping me understand how dismissive I've been of your career. I genuinely didn't understand the significance of your rank or what you've accomplished. I know that ignorance doesn't excuse my behavior, but I want you to know I'm trying to educate myself now. Can we please talk when you have time? I want to make this right between us." The apology was more substantive than I had expected, acknowledging specific harm rather than offering vague regret about general tensions. The mention of Marcus being upset with her provided context for the timing and perhaps the motivation for her outreach. I wondered how much of her desire to make things right stemmed from genuine remorse, and how much came from discomfort with her husband's disapproval. The distinction mattered, though I recognized that motivation was complex and could encompass multiple factors simultaneously. I did not respond immediately to her message, needing time to consider what outcome I actually wanted from renewed communication with my sister. Did I want an apology and acknowledgement of past harm? Did I want a fundamentally different relationship going forward? Did I want to maintain minimal contact sufficient for family obligations but without real intimacy or understanding? The answers were not immediately clear, complicated by years of accumulated hurt alongside genuine memories of earlier closeness before the comparisons and competition had become the defining feature of our relationship. The afternoon brought meetings with representatives from several allied nations, discussions about training scenarios and capability demonstrations for the upcoming exercise. The work required my full attention, pushing personal preoccupations to the background as I navigated the diplomatic and military considerations involved in multinational coordination. There was satisfaction in the complexity of the work, in seeing disparate pieces come together through careful planning and relationship building. This was leadership of a different sort than combat command, but it drew on the same fundamental skills of understanding people and systems, anticipating challenges, and building consensus around shared objectives. As the workday concluded and I prepared to leave the Pentagon, my phone rang with a call from Marcus. This was unexpected enough that I answered immediately, curious about what would prompt him to reach out directly rather than through Vanessa. "Elena, I hope I'm not overstepping by calling you directly," he began, his tone formal but warm. "I wanted to speak with you separately from Vanessa about what happened last night. I've spent a lot of time today thinking about my own responsibility in the dynamic between you and your sister, and I realized I need to acknowledge something to you personally." He paused, and I could hear him gathering his thoughts, the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to choosing words with precision. "I've been married to Vanessa for 18 years, and in all that time, I never once challenged her characterization of your military service as somehow less valuable or respectable than traditional civilian professional paths. I accepted her framing without question, which implicitly supported her dismissiveness toward you. Last night, seeing your actual rank and hearing about your deployments and leadership experience, I was confronted with how profoundly wrong I had been to accept such a limited and frankly insulting view of what you do." His voice carried genuine distress, the sound of someone grappling with uncomfortable self-recognition. I remained silent, allowing him space to continue. "What troubles me most is that I should have known better. I work with veterans through our firm's pro bono program. I understand military structure and the significance of senior officer ranks. But I compartmentalize that knowledge, never applying it to you because it was easier to accept Vanessa's narrative than to challenge her or examine my own assumptions. That was cowardice on my part, and it contributed to years of you being undervalued and dismissed by your own family." The apology was more thorough and thoughtful than anything I had anticipated receiving from him. His willingness to name his own complicity rather than simply defending or explaining Vanessa's behavior spoke to a level of moral seriousness that I had not previously associated with him. Our limited previous interactions had been pleasant but superficial, never revealing the depth of character that this conversation suggested. "I appreciate you saying that, Marcus," I responded, my voice careful and controlled. "It means something to hear you acknowledge the pattern rather than treating last night as an isolated incident." "It absolutely was not isolated," he said firmly, "and I want you to know that I've had very direct conversations with Vanessa today about how unacceptable her behavior has been. She's upset and defensive, which I expected, but she's also genuinely shocked by how I've responded to all of this. I think she assumed I would support her position or help smooth things over, and instead I've been very clear that she owes you not just an apology but a fundamental change in how she thinks about and treats you." There was something both gratifying and sad about hearing that Marcus was holding Vanessa accountable. Gratifying because it validated my experience and challenged behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. Sad because it highlighted how isolated I had been in my family, with no one else willing to name or confront the dynamic that had made me feel perpetually less than. "The reason I'm calling," Marcus continued, "is that I wanted to invite you to have coffee with me sometime this week, separate from Vanessa. I'd like to learn more about your career and your experiences, to actually understand what you do and what you've accomplished. And I'd also like to talk about whether there are ways I can support better dynamics in this family going forward. I recognize that as Vanessa's husband, I have some influence and responsibility regarding how she treats her sister." The invitation surprised me with its directness and the clear statement that he saw himself as having agency and responsibility in family dynamics, rather than being simply a neutral observer. I found myself agreeing to meet him for coffee later in the week, curious about what might emerge from a conversation with someone who seemed genuinely committed to understanding rather than just smoothing over conflict. After we concluded the call, I sat in my car in the Pentagon parking lot, watching military personnel and civilian employees stream toward their vehicles in the evening exodus. The day had brought multiple unexpected developments, each requiring me to reconsider assumptions about family members and their capacity for growth or change. Vanessa's apology message, Marcus's phone call, even my mother's text that had initially frustrated me. All of these represented people responding to the boundary I had finally established by refusing to accept dismissive treatment anymore. The question I faced now was what I wanted to do with these responses. I could maintain rigid boundaries and minimal contact, protecting myself from further hurt, but also foreclosing possibilities for different kinds of relationships. I could cautiously engage with the overtures being made, testing whether genuine change was possible, while remaining alert to patterns reasserting themselves. I could attempt to articulate what I needed from family relationships going forward, providing a clear framework rather than simply reacting to whatever dynamics others created. None of these options felt entirely safe or comfortable. All of them required vulnerability and the risk of being disappointed or hurt again. But as I thought about the conversation with Robert Harrison, the veteran who had written to me about finding validation among those who understood rather than constantly seeking it from those who did not, I realized that the question was not really about what my family could offer me. The question was about what kind of person I wanted to be, what kind of relationships I wanted to cultivate, and whether I was willing to allow others the opportunity to grow and change even if that growth came embarrassingly late. I drove home through the evening traffic, my mind moving between the strategic challenges of the multinational exercise I was coordinating and the interpersonal challenges of family relationships that had reached a crisis point. There was a strange parallel between the two situations, both requiring careful navigation of competing interests and entrenched positions, both demanding that I find ways to build bridges while maintaining clear boundaries about what was and was not acceptable. When I arrived at my apartment, I found a package waiting at the door. Opening it revealed a book about military history with a note card attached. The handwriting was Vanessa's, her distinctive precise cursive unmistakable. Elena, I ordered this book today and paid for rush delivery, because I realized I know almost nothing about the military history that shaped your career choice. I want to understand better. I want to be a better sister. I know this is just a small gesture, but I'm hoping it shows you that I'm serious about changing. Please call me when you're ready to talk. Love, Vanessa. The gesture was thoughtful in a way that acknowledged both her ignorance and her desire to address it. The rushed delivery suggested urgency and investment rather than a token effort. I set the book on my coffee table and stared at it for a long moment, this tangible evidence that something had shifted in my sister's awareness, that the confrontation at her dinner party had penetrated defenses I had assumed were impermeable. I thought about the younger versions of ourselves, before the comparisons and competitions had created such distance between us. There had been a period in our childhood when we had been genuinely close, when Vanessa had been protective of me, and I had admired her confidence and capability. That relationship had eroded gradually as our parents' differential treatment and differing life paths had created a hierarchy that neither of us had consciously chosen but both had inhabited. The sister who had made the dress-up comment was not the whole truth of who Vanessa was, just as the bitter, defensive woman I had become in family contexts was not the whole truth of who I was. I picked up my phone and composed a response to her earlier text message. Thank you for the book and for your message this morning. I appreciate the apology and the effort you're making to understand my career. I'm not ready for an extended conversation yet, because I'm still processing a lot of accumulated hurt from years of feeling dismissed by you and the family. But I'm willing to talk when I've had more time to think about what I need going forward. I want us to have a better relationship, but that will require real changes in how we interact, not just acknowledgement that past interactions were hurtful. The message was honest about my current state while leaving space for future connection. It set boundaries without slamming doors, acknowledged her efforts without pretending that an apology erased decades of pain. Sending it felt like another step in the unfamiliar process of advocating for myself within family relationships, refusing to minimize my needs or rush toward reconciliation before I was genuinely ready. Her response came within minutes, a simple message that carried unexpected weight. I understand and I respect that you need time. I'll be here when you're ready. I'm sorry I didn't see you clearly before now. You deserved better from me. I set the phone down and moved to the window, looking out over the city lights beginning to glow in the descending darkness. Somewhere in this metropolitan area, thousands of service members were finishing their workdays, heading home to families who might or might not fully understand what they did or why it mattered. Some of those service members probably struggled with the same questions I faced about how to bridge the gap between military and civilian worlds, how to help loved ones understand experiences that resisted easy explanation, how to maintain relationships across profound differences in life experience and values. The military provided clear structures for recognition and advancement, explicit acknowledgement of achievement through rank and awards. But the recognition that actually sustained you through difficult deployments and personal sacrifices was not primarily the formal decorations. It was the respect of those who served alongside you, the knowledge that you had led well when it mattered, the understanding that your contribution had meaning even if it was invisible to most of the population you protected. That recognition had always been sufficient for me professionally. But the human need for family acknowledgement and acceptance had persisted despite my best efforts to dismiss it as unnecessary or childish. Last night's dinner party had forced into the open a conflict that had been simmering beneath polite family interactions for decades. The resolution, if there was to be one, would not come quickly or easily. Vanessa's apology and apparent willingness to change were promising, but would need to be tested over time, through consistent different behavior, rather than simply accepting her stated intentions. Marcus's support and recognition mattered, but could not substitute for direct work between Vanessa and me to rebuild trust and establish healthier patterns. My mother's reflexive defense of Vanessa and expectation that I should apologize represented dynamics that would likely persist, even if my relationship with my sister improved. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful that change was possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. The boundary I had established by refusing to accept dismissive treatment had created space for new kinds of interactions. Whether my family members would rise to meet that space with genuine growth remained to be seen. But I knew with absolute certainty that I would no longer participate in my own diminishment, would no longer accept being made small to accommodate others' comfort or limited understanding. The uniform hanging in my closet represented a life built on discipline, service, and the pursuit of excellence measured against rigorous standards. The woman who wore that uniform had led soldiers through combat, had made decisions affecting hundreds of lives, had earned the respect of peers and superiors through demonstrated competence and character. That woman deserved to be seen clearly by her family, to have her achievements recognized and valued, rather than dismissed or minimized. Whether that recognition ultimately came from them or not, I now understood that my worth was not contingent on their ability to perceive it. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the upcoming coffee meeting with Marcus and the eventual conversation I would need to have with Vanessa. I thought about the multinational exercise I was coordinating and the complex diplomatic work of building cooperation across different national militaries. I thought about Robert Harrison's email and his reminder that the recognition of those who understand is what actually matters. All of these thoughts wove together, creating a tapestry of professional purpose and personal reckoning that felt like standing at a crossroads where multiple paths forward were becoming visible. The journey ahead would require courage different from what combat leadership demanded but no less real. It would require the vulnerability of allowing family members to see me fully while maintaining boundaries about acceptable treatment. It would require patience with their learning process while not accepting renewed dismissiveness disguised as good intentions. It would require that I continue building a life of meaning and purpose whether or not they ever fully appreciated what I had chosen and accomplished. But as I finally drifted toward sleep, I felt something I had not experienced in relation to my family for many years. Not quite peace, which seemed premature given the unresolved tensions and uncertain outcomes ahead, but something closer to peace than I had known before. A sense that I had finally stopped apologizing for who I was and what I had chosen. A recognition that their inability to understand my path said nothing about the validity of that path. A beginning fragile and uncertain but genuine, of reclaiming my own story from the diminished narrative that others had imposed. The coffee shop Marcus had suggested for our meeting was a quiet establishment several blocks from his law firm, the kind of place where professionals conducted informal business discussions, away from the formality of conference rooms. I arrived 10 minutes early, a habit ingrained by military punctuality standards that made civilian concepts of on time feel perpetually late. The morning air carried the crisp quality of early autumn, and the walk from the parking garage had given me time to consider what I hoped to accomplish in this conversation. Marcus appeared precisely at the appointed time, still wearing his suit from what had clearly been a morning of client meetings. He spotted me at a corner table and approached with a warm smile that seemed more genuine than the polite expressions I remembered from previous family gatherings. After ordering coffee, he settled into the chair across from me and began speaking with a directness that I appreciated. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Elena. I've been thinking constantly since the dinner party about how to address what I'm increasingly recognizing as a significant failure on my part. Not just regarding that specific evening, but concerning years of passive complicity in a family dynamic that diminished you unfairly." His opening acknowledged responsibility without defensive qualifications, setting a tone that immediately distinguished this conversation from typical family interactions where everyone tried to avoid blame, while subtly redirecting it elsewhere. I nodded, encouraging him to continue while I considered how much of my own perspective to share immediately versus waiting to hear more of his thinking. "I want to start by asking you something that I should have asked years ago," he continued, his expression serious and focused. "What is your actual role at the Pentagon? What does your daily work involve? I realize I've spent nearly 2 decades knowing you only as Vanessa's sister who works in the military, without ever understanding what that actually means in practical terms." The question was both simple and profound, representing the basic curiosity that had been absent from every previous interaction we had shared. I took a moment to organize my response, wanting to provide information that would be meaningful to someone with his legal and business background, while avoiding either oversimplification or overwhelming technical detail. "My current assignment involves coordinating multinational military training exercises and strategic initiatives among allied nations," I explained. "In practical terms, that means I work with military representatives from countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and others to plan joint operations that build interoperability and strengthen alliance relationships. The work requires understanding not just military tactics and logistics, but also the political considerations that shape what each nation can commit to these collaborative efforts." Marcus leaned forward, his attention complete and genuine. "That sounds incredibly complex from a diplomatic perspective alone, even before considering the military operational elements. How did you develop the expertise for that kind of work?" "Through a combination of deployment experiences, advanced military education, and progressive leadership positions over 2 decades, I responded. "I've commanded units at multiple levels, deployed to combat zones where coalition operations were essential to mission success, and attended war colleges where we study not just military history and strategy, but also international relations and cross-cultural leadership. The rank of colonel typically comes after 20 to 25 years of service for those who advance through competitive selection processes at each promotion level." He absorbed this information with visible surprise, apparently reassessing assumptions he had held without examination. "When Vanessa talks about your career, which admittedly hasn't been often, she's always framed it as you being in the Army doing something with logistics or administration. She's never mentioned command positions or combat deployments or the diplomatic dimensions you just described. I'm not sure if that's because she doesn't know these details or because she's chosen not to engage with them." "Probably both," I said, hearing the years of accumulated frustration in my own voice despite efforts to maintain composure. I stopped trying to explain my work to the family years ago because the conversations felt futile. When I did share information about deployments or leadership positions, the response was usually polite disinterest or comments suggesting I should consider transitioning to civilian employment, where I could have a more normal life. The underlying message was always that my career was acceptable as a temporary phase but concerning as a long-term commitment. Marcus winced at this characterization, recognizing its accuracy. "That matches what I've observed in family gatherings, though I'm ashamed to admit I never questioned it. Your parents would talk about Vanessa's career progression with obvious pride, detailing her cases and professional recognition. But when conversation turned to you, there would be this vague acknowledgement that you were still in the military, followed by quick subject changes. I interpreted that pattern as everyone being respectful of your privacy rather than seeing it as what it actually was, which was dismissal of your accomplishments. The validation of my experience by someone who had witnessed the family dynamics from an outside perspective felt significant. For years I had questioned whether I was being oversensitive about treatment that might have been unintentionally neutral rather than deliberately dismissive. Hearing Marcus name the pattern clearly confirmed that my perception had been accurate, that the differential treatment had been real and observable rather than imagined or exaggerated. The dinner party was a revelation for me in multiple ways, Marcus continued, his tone becoming more personal. Obviously there was the shock of learning your actual rank and understanding what that represents. But beyond that specific information, I was confronted with my own willingness to accept Vanessa's framing of reality without independent verification. In my professional life, I would never rely solely on one party's characterization of a situation, without investigating other perspectives. Yet in my personal life, in my own family, I did exactly that for 18 years. That recognition has been deeply uncomfortable. I appreciated his willingness to sit with that discomfort rather than rushing to absolve himself or move past it quickly. What prompted you to suddenly question the narrative? Was it just seeing the rank insignia? Or was there something else? He considered the question carefully before responding. The rank insignia was certainly the catalyst, the moment when I realized that the person standing in our foyer was not who I had believed her to be. But what really affected me was watching your face when Vanessa made that dress-up comment. There was this flash of pain that you suppressed almost immediately, returning to composure so quickly that I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking directly at you. In that moment, I recognized that this was not the first time you had been hurt by that kind of dismissiveness. The speed of your emotional control suggested years of practice managing pain inflicted by people who should have been supporting you. His observation was uncomfortably accurate, penetrating defenses I had assumed were invisible to family members who seemed so oblivious to the impact of their treatment. The fact that he had noticed my momentary vulnerability and understood its implications suggested a level of emotional intelligence that I had not previously associated with him, based on our limited superficial interactions. After that moment, I started really listening to what you said during dinner, he continued. The story about earning your Bronze Star was obviously significant from a military awards perspective. But what struck me even more was how you told it. You were matter-of-fact about having made life-and-death decisions under fire, about organizing evacuation of civilians while under attack, about losing your interpreter who died protecting your withdrawal. The emotional control required to discuss those experiences calmly at a dinner party, while also conveying the human cost involved, that demonstrated a kind of leadership and character that I had completely failed to recognize in you previously. His analysis revealed that he had been processing the evening at multiple levels, moving beyond simple surprise about my rank to deeper questions about character and the experiences that shaped it. This kind of reflective engagement was exactly what had been missing from family interactions throughout my military career, where information about my work was either ignored or treated as vaguely interesting but ultimately irrelevant to the important business of civilian professional and personal life. I went home that night and did something I should have done years ago, Marcus said. I researched military ranks, the promotion timeline for officers, the selection rates at different levels. I learned that only about 1 in 10 officers makes it to lieutenant colonel, and only about 1 in 20 reaches full colonel. I read about what coalition operations involve, about the complexity of commanding units in combat environments, about the education requirements for senior military leaders. Every piece of information reinforced how profoundly I had underestimated both your accomplishments and the character required to achieve them. He paused, and I could see him struggling with how to articulate something that clearly mattered deeply to him. I've built my career on being thorough, on not making assumptions, on understanding the full context before forming conclusions. The realization that I had failed to apply those same standards to someone in my own family, that I had been content with ignorance about your life and work, has been profoundly troubling. It's made me question what other areas of my life I've been approaching with similar laziness or willful blindness. The conversation had moved beyond simply discussing my military career to larger questions about integrity, and the ways people sometimes fail to extend to family members the same care and rigor they apply in professional contexts. I found myself reassessing Marcus as well, moving beyond my own assumptions about him as simply Vanessa's successful, but somewhat peripheral husband to seeing him as someone capable of genuine self-examination and growth. What you're describing resonates with me, I offered, deciding to share more of my own perspective. I've spent years questioning whether I was expecting too much from my family, whether it was unreasonable to want them to understand and value my career choices. There were times when I convinced myself that the problem was my own sensitivity, that I needed to accept that civilian family members simply couldn't relate to military service and I should stop wanting recognition from people whose frame of reference didn't include what I did. But the truth is that understanding doesn't require shared experience. It requires curiosity and respect, qualities that were consistently absent from how my family engaged with my work. Marcus nodded emphatically. That's exactly right. I don't need to have served in the military to understand that leading soldiers in combat requires exceptional skill and courage. I don't need personal deployment experience to recognize that coordinating multinational operations demands diplomatic and strategic abilities. The information was available if I had cared enough to seek it out. My failure wasn't about lacking relevant experience. It was about lacking sufficient interest and respect to educate myself about what someone I claimed to care about was actually doing with her life. The directness of his self-criticism was both refreshing and somewhat uncomfortable, forcing me to consider my own complicity in family dynamics that I typically framed as entirely beyond my control. Had I been too passive in allowing my accomplishments to be minimized, too willing to accept dismissiveness rather than demanding better treatment? The question felt important even though it risked sliding into self-blame for others' failures to treat me appropriately. I want to ask you something that might be difficult, Marcus said, his tone becoming more tentative. What do you need from your family at this point? Not what Vanessa thinks you need or what your parents assume would fix things, but what would actually make a difference for you in terms of feeling seen and respected. The question caught me unprepared despite having spent considerable time since the dinner party thinking about exactly this issue. Articulating needs felt vulnerable in ways that maintaining defensive distance did not, requiring me to acknowledge that family relationships still mattered enough to warrant the risk of disappointment if those needs went unmet. I need people to stop treating my military service as an extended youthful rebellion or unfortunate detour from a proper civilian professional path. I began slowly, working to clarify thoughts that had been inchoate feelings until this moment. I need recognition that the choices I've made involved sacrifice but also generated meaning and accomplishment that are valuable on their own terms, not valuable only to the extent they eventually lead me back to the kind of life my family understands and approves of. I need people to extend basic curiosity about my work, to ask questions and actually listen to answers rather than changing subjects as quickly as possible. And I need them to stop making casual dismissive comments disguised as jokes, because those comments reveal fundamental disrespect that an apology doesn't erase unless it's accompanied by genuine change in behavior and attitude. Marcus listened with complete attention, and I could see him mentally cataloging the specific needs I had articulated. Those all seem like reasonable expectations for basic family respect, he observed. The fact that you've gone without them for so long, that you've had to explicitly articulate needs that should be automatic, that says something troubling about how your family has functioned. What makes it more complicated, I continued, feeling my way through thoughts I had not fully formulated before speaking them aloud, is that I'm not sure I trust that people can actually change patterns that have been established for decades. Vanessa has apologized and says she wants to do better, and I want to believe that's genuine. But I've also watched her maintain essentially the same personality and approach to relationships throughout her adult life. The idea that one confrontation would fundamentally alter how she sees me and treats me feels optimistic to the point of naive. That skepticism is completely understandable, Marcus responded. Trust that's been damaged over years can't be rebuilt through a single apology or even several thoughtful conversations. It requires sustained different behavior over time, demonstrated commitment to change rather than just expressed intention to change. I can't promise you that Vanessa will do the work required to genuinely transform your relationship, because that's ultimately her choice and responsibility. What I can tell you is that I'm committed to not enabling dismissive behavior going forward, to challenging it when I observe it rather than remaining passively complicit as I have been. His commitment to active intervention rather than passive observation represented a significant shift that could potentially influence family dynamics beyond just his relationship with me. If Vanessa encountered consistent pushback from her husband when she made dismissive comments about my career, that external accountability might motivate change more effectively than my own objections had ever done. There's something else I want to discuss with you, Marcus said, shifting the conversation in a new direction. Vanessa mentioned that your parents have essentially taken her side in this situation, that your mother sent you a message suggesting you should apologize for embarrassing Vanessa at the dinner party. That response from your parents troubles me because it suggests they don't understand what actually occurred, or why it mattered. I'm wondering if it would be helpful for me to speak with them, to provide an outside perspective on what happened and why Vanessa's behavior was inappropriate. The offer surprised me with its potential significance. Throughout my adult life, conflicts with Vanessa had been adjudicated by our parents in ways that consistently positioned her as the reasonable one and me as too sensitive or difficult. The idea of someone from outside that sibling dynamic intervening to present a different perspective felt both appealing and concerning. Appealing because it might actually shift their understanding in ways my own explanations never had. Concerning because it might also create additional family conflict, or put Marcus in an uncomfortable position that could ultimately harm his relationship with Vanessa. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I'm not sure it's your responsibility to educate my parents about how they failed to treat me appropriately. That feels like something that should come from me, even though previous attempts to raise these issues with them have been largely unsuccessful. Marcus considered this response before offering a different perspective. I understand your hesitation, and you're right that ultimately this is between you and your parents. But I also think there's value in them hearing from someone they respect professionally and personally that their treatment of you has been problematic. Not as a substitute for you articulating your own needs and boundaries, but as corroboration that your perceptions are accurate and your expectations are reasonable. Sometimes people dismiss feedback from the person directly affected while taking seriously the same observations from someone they consider neutral or authoritative. His analysis matched my own understanding of how my parents operated, their tendency to discount my perspective as biased while accepting similar assessments from others they viewed as more objective. The pattern was frustrating but also represented a potential opportunity, if Marcus was genuinely willing to advocate for different treatment of me within family contexts. If you're truly comfortable doing that, if it won't create problems in your relationship with Vanessa or make family gatherings unbearably awkward, then I would welcome your perspective being shared with my parents, I acknowledged. But I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to fix my family relationships, or to position yourself as mediator. What I need most is for people to simply stop actively making things worse through dismissive or hurtful behavior. Positive relationship development beyond that baseline of basic respect feels like something that may or may not be possible depending on everyone's willingness to engage differently. That's a very reasonable framework, Marcus agreed. Establishing baseline respect as the non-negotiable foundation, with deeper relationship development as something that requires mutual effort over time. I'll speak with your parents soon, framing the conversation around my own observations from the dinner party and my subsequent reflection on family dynamics. If that helps create space for you to have more productive direct conversations with them, then it will have served its purpose. We spent the remainder of our time together discussing less fraught topics, with Marcus asking questions about my Pentagon assignment and the challenges of multinational military coordination. His questions revealed genuine interest rather than polite conversation filling, and I found myself sharing more detailed information about my work than I typically did with civilian family members. The conversation felt surprisingly comfortable, suggesting that relationship building between us might be possible despite years of superficial interaction. As we prepared to leave, Marcus made one final comment that stayed with me long after we parted ways. I want you to know that regardless of how things develop with Vanessa or your parents, I now see you clearly as the accomplished professional and leader you are. That recognition isn't contingent on others in the family coming to similar understanding. Your worth and your achievements exist independently of whether or not we've been smart enough to recognize them. I'm sorry it took me so long to actually look. The statement carried weight because it came from someone who had no obligation to care about my professional validation, who gained nothing personally from offering recognition that had been withheld by others. His words represented a form of witnessing, an acknowledgement that my experience and accomplishments were real and significant regardless of whether my immediate family had been capable of perceiving them accurately. Driving back to my apartment after the meeting, I found myself reflecting on how much had shifted in just a few days since the dinner party. What had begun as a decision to stop minimizing myself to accommodate family comfort had cascaded into multiple people reassessing their own behavior and the family dynamics they had previously accepted without question. The changes were still fragile and uncertain, requiring ongoing effort and commitment to solidify into genuinely different patterns. But the possibility of transformation felt more real than it had at any previous point in my adult relationship with my family. That evening, I finally responded to Vanessa's earlier message, suggesting we meet for lunch later in the week to have the conversation she had requested. Her response came immediately, expressing gratitude and relief that I was willing to talk. I felt cautiously optimistic about the meeting, while also maintaining realistic expectations about how much could actually change in a single conversation after decades of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. The work week continued with its demands, meetings and briefings and coordination challenges that required my full professional attention. But underneath the daily tasks, I carried a sense that something fundamental had shifted in how I understood my own worth and my right to demand respectful treatment from people who claimed to care about me. The uniform I wore represented choices I had made deliberately and values I had embraced fully. Those choices deserved recognition not because I needed external validation to feel good about them, but because basic family respect required acknowledging who I actually was rather than constantly wishing I were someone different. The path forward remained uncertain, relationships still strained and outcomes far from guaranteed. But I had stopped apologizing for my own existence, stopped accommodating dismissiveness to keep peace, stopped accepting the role of perpetual disappointment that my family had assigned me. Whatever emerged from this period of upheaval and reckoning, I knew I would meet it as the person I had become through decades of service and sacrifice, not as the diminished version of myself that had been easier for others to accept. That commitment to showing up fully and demanding commensurate respect felt like the beginning of something important, fragile but genuine, built on a foundation that could finally support the weight of authentic connection, or, if necessary, the dignity of appropriate distance. The restaurant Vanessa had selected for our lunch meeting occupied a converted historic building in the downtown area, the kind of establishment that balanced upscale atmosphere with enough casual flexibility to accommodate conversations that might become emotional or difficult. I arrived early again, a pattern so ingrained that attempting to arrive merely on time would have required conscious effort and generated unnecessary anxiety. The hostess seated me at a corner table that offered some privacy from surrounding diners, and I used the waiting time to center myself mentally for the conversation ahead. Vanessa appeared exactly at noon, her professional attire suggesting she had taken time off from work for this meeting. She looked nervous in a way I had rarely seen from her, the usual confidence that characterized her public presentation replaced by visible uncertainty about how this interaction would unfold. She approached the table with hesitant steps and managed a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she began as she settled into her chair, her hands fidgeting with the menu in a way that betrayed her discomfort. "I wasn't sure you would after everything that happened. I've been trying to figure out what to say, how to explain or apologize adequately, and I keep coming back to the realization that there probably aren't words sufficient to address years of treating you badly." Her opening acknowledgement was more direct than I had anticipated, cutting through potential small talk to immediately name the core issue between us. I appreciated the directness, even as I recognized that we were only beginning what would likely be a lengthy and difficult conversation about patterns that had shaped our relationship for decades. "I think we should start by being honest about what has actually been happening between us rather than trying to minimize or explain it away," I responded, keeping my tone measured and calm despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "The dress-up comment at your dinner party was hurtful, but it wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It represented a consistent pattern of dismissiveness toward my military career that has characterized your attitude for more than 20 years. Vanessa's face flushed, but she nodded rather than attempting to defend or qualify the observation. "You're absolutely right. That comment was consistent with how I've thought about and talked about your career choices for your entire adult life. I've treated your military service as something embarrassing or concerning, as evidence that you were making poor decisions or refusing to grow up and pursue a real career. I've made jokes at your expense, changed subjects when people asked about your work, and generally communicated in countless ways that I didn't respect what you were doing with your life. The comprehensive acknowledgement surprised me with its completeness and lack of defensive qualifications. Vanessa was not attempting to parse which specific behaviors had been problematic while defending others as misunderstood or unintentional. She was accepting responsibility for a broad pattern that had caused sustained harm over an extended period. The approach suggested she had done substantial reflection since the dinner party rather than simply preparing surface-level apologies designed to quickly restore family harmony. "What I'm struggling to understand," I said, deciding to push deeper into questions that had troubled me for years, "is why you felt such contempt for my career choices. We were relatively close as children before I enlisted. What changed that made you view my path with such consistent dismissiveness?" Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, her expression suggesting she was grappling with questions she had perhaps avoided examining directly. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability I had not heard from her in years. "I think part of it was genuine confusion and concern when you first enlisted. You were bright and capable, and from my perspective at the time, choosing military service instead of university seemed like you were limiting your options unnecessarily. I worried that you were making a decision at 18 that would constrain your entire future, that you would regret not pursuing education and professional opportunities that seemed more prestigious and financially rewarding." She paused, gathering courage to continue with what was clearly more difficult territory. "But if I'm being completely honest, there was also an element of threat in your choice. Our parents had always positioned us in comparison to each other, with me as the successful achiever, and you as the one who struggled to measure up. When you chose a path that was completely outside their framework for evaluating success, you were essentially refusing to participate in the competition they had created. That should have been liberating for both of us, but instead it felt destabilizing to me because so much of my identity was built on being the daughter who met their expectations." Her analysis revealed dynamics I had sensed but never heard articulated so directly. The competition between us had not been created by either of us individually but rather imposed by parents who constantly compared our achievements and found one or both of us wanting depending on the metric being applied. My departure from that comparative framework through military service should have freed both of us from an unhealthy dynamic, but instead Vanessa had experienced it as a rejection of shared rules that left her uncertain about how to define success or understand our relationship. "When you started succeeding in the military, earning promotions and taking on significant responsibilities, that threatened the narrative I had constructed about your choices," Vanessa continued, her words coming faster now as if she needed to complete this difficult confession before courage failed. "If your military career was actually valuable and meaningful, if you were accomplishing important things and developing capabilities that mattered, then my dismissiveness was revealed as ignorance rather than informed judgment. It was easier to maintain my belief that you had made poor choices than to examine whether my own framework for evaluating success was too narrow." The honesty of her self-examination impressed me even as the content confirmed years of suspicion about the insecurity underlying her superior attitude. She had needed me to be making mistakes or wasting potential in order to maintain her own sense of being the successful sister, the one who had chosen wisely and merited the pride our parents directed toward her. My actual accomplishments threatened that identity structure, creating motivation to minimize or dismiss evidence that contradicted her preferred narrative. "Marcus has been helping me understand how much my treatment of you was about my own insecurity rather than any actual shortcoming in your choices or achievements," Vanessa acknowledged, referencing conversations with her husband that had apparently pushed her toward uncomfortable self-recognition. "He's been pretty direct about how my need to feel superior damaged our relationship and prevented me from seeing you clearly. It's been difficult to accept that I've been the one creating distance and conflict while telling myself I was just being realistic about your decisions." I absorbed her words while considering my own role in patterns that had persisted for so long. I contributed to the dynamic by not challenging your dismissiveness more directly for many years. I accepted the role of the family disappointment and stopped trying to explain or justify my choices because it felt futile. That silence probably reinforced your assumptions rather than challenging them. If I had been more assertive about demanding respect, maybe things would have developed differently between us. Vanessa shook her head firmly, rejecting my attempt to shoulder shared responsibility for her behavior. "You shouldn't have had to demand basic respect for your career and accomplishments. The burden of fixing this dynamic was never yours to carry. I was the one choosing to be dismissive and superior." The fact that you eventually stopped trying to correct my misperceptions was a reasonable response to consistent invalidation, not a failure on your part to adequately defend yourself. Her refusal to allow me to minimize her responsibility represented an important shift from previous family patterns where accountability was diffused through mutual blame, and both parties apologizing for vaguely defined contributions to conflict. She was claiming full ownership of her choices and their impact rather than seeking to establish that we had both contributed equally to relationship breakdown. The server approached to take our orders, providing a natural break in the intense conversation. After she departed, Vanessa redirected the discussion toward more concrete questions about repair and moving forward. "I've been reading about military structure and the significance of different ranks," she said, pulling out her phone to show me bookmarked articles and resources she had apparently been studying. "I'm embarrassed by how little I knew about what your rank actually means, about the selection processes and the level of responsibility involved in senior officer positions. I should have educated myself years ago rather than remaining deliberately ignorant while making judgments based on that ignorance." I looked at the resources she had compiled, recognizing several authoritative military publications, alongside more general explanatory articles designed for civilian audiences. The effort she had invested in self-education was evident and meaningful, suggesting genuine desire to understand rather than simply performing contrition sufficient to restore relationship equilibrium. "What surprised me most in reading about military careers," Vanessa continued, "was learning about the sacrifice involved in reaching senior ranks. The frequent moves, the deployments away from any stable home, the constant evaluation and competition for advancement, the physical and emotional demands of leadership under dangerous conditions. I had somehow convinced myself that military service was an easier path than civilian professional development, that you had chosen something less demanding than what I was doing. The reality is that you've been operating under pressures and making sacrifices that I can barely comprehend from my comfortable civilian life." Her recognition of the sacrifice involved in military service touched something deep that I had rarely allowed myself to fully acknowledge. The costs of my career choices had been significant and ongoing, affecting every dimension of personal life and relationships. Hearing those costs named and valued by someone who had previously dismissed them created an unexpected emotional response that I struggled to contain. The hardest parts haven't been the obvious things like deployments or dangerous situations. I found myself sharing, surprised by my own willingness to be vulnerable with someone who had so consistently failed to handle my vulnerability with care. The hardest parts have been the isolation of being in a profession that most people don't understand, the loneliness of not having a stable home or community, the grief of sacrificing normal life milestones like marriage and children, because the demands of military service made those things extremely difficult to sustain. I've made peace with those sacrifices because the work matters to me, but they have been genuine losses that shaped my life in profound ways. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears as I spoke, her emotional response suggesting she was genuinely absorbing the human cost of choices she had dismissed as incomprehensible or regrettable. "I'm so sorry that you've carried those losses without support or recognition from your own family. You deserve to have people who understood that you were making difficult choices for reasons that mattered to you, who validated the significance of what you were sacrificing rather than treating your entire career as a mistake that you would eventually correct by transitioning to civilian life." The conversation shifted as we ate our meals, moving through various aspects of our shared history, and the specific incidents that had accumulated into the damaged relationship we were now attempting to address. Vanessa asked questions about deployment experiences, about what leading soldiers in combat had been like, about the relationships I had formed with people I served alongside. Her questions reflected genuine curiosity rather than polite conversation, and I found myself sharing stories and reflections that I typically reserved for fellow service members who understood the context without extensive explanation. "There's something I need to tell you that might be difficult to hear," Vanessa said as our lunch plates were cleared and coffee arrived. "Mom called me the day after your dinner party, after I had told her about what happened. Her first response was to be angry with you for embarrassing me in front of my guests. She suggested that you had deliberately worn your uniform to create drama or make me look bad, that you were being vindictive because of old sibling rivalries." The information stung despite being entirely predictable based on my mother's historical pattern of reflexively defending Vanessa, while positioning me as the difficult or oversensitive one. I had expected her to take Vanessa's side but had harbored some small hope that the circumstances might prompt different response. I didn't let that interpretation stand unchallenged, Vanessa continued, her voice firm with determination. I told her explicitly that you had worn your uniform because you're a senior military officer, and that was entirely appropriate attire for a formal dinner. I explained that my dress-up comment was cruel and dismissive, that Marcus had been appalled by how I treated you, and that I was deeply ashamed of my behavior. I made clear that you had done nothing wrong, and that any embarrassment I experienced was entirely the result of my own actions being exposed as inappropriate. Her account of defending me to our mother represented a reversal of lifetime patterns that felt significant beyond the specific incident. Vanessa had typically allowed or even encouraged our mother's tendency to excuse her behavior while criticizing mine. Her choice to instead claim responsibility and correct our mother's misinterpretation suggested genuine commitment to changing dynamics, rather than simply managing immediate conflict. How did she respond to that? I asked, needing to understand whether Vanessa's advocacy had any impact on our mother's perspective. Not well initially, Vanessa admitted. She was confused and defensive, suggesting I was being too hard on myself, and that you were equally responsible for the awkward situation. But I persisted, explaining in detail what I had learned about your career and rank, about the accomplishments I had dismissed or minimized for years. I told her that we as a family had failed you by never taking the time to understand what you were actually doing, or why it mattered. By the end of the conversation, she was quieter and said she needed to think about what I had said. The image of Vanessa advocating for me to our mother, pushing back against established narratives and insisting on accurate understanding, created cautious hope that family dynamics might actually shift in meaningful ways. Our mother's resistance was expected, but not necessarily final if multiple family members consistently presented alternative perspectives that challenged her preferred interpretations. Marcus is planning to talk with both mom and dad separately, Vanessa added. He thinks they need to hear from someone outside the sister dynamic about how problematic their differential treatment of us has been. He's been very direct with me about how your accomplishments deserve recognition regardless of whether they understand military service, that basic parental support should not be contingent on children choosing careers that conform to parental preferences. The coordination between Vanessa and Marcus around addressing family patterns suggested they had been having extensive conversations about issues that went beyond the immediate conflict at the dinner party. Their joint commitment to advocating for different treatment of me represented support I had never experienced from family members, creating possibilities for change that had seemed impossible just days earlier. I want to be clear about something, Vanessa said, her tone becoming more serious and formal. I'm not asking you to immediately forgive me, or to pretend that one lunch conversation erases years of hurt. I understand that rebuilding trust will require sustained different behavior over extended time, that words are insufficient without corresponding actions. What I'm asking is for permission to try, for the opportunity to demonstrate through consistent changed behavior that I'm capable of being the sister you deserve to have all along. Her framing of the request acknowledged the power dynamics involved in reconciliation after harm, recognizing that I held the decision about whether to allow her back into relationship after years of dismissive treatment. The respect implicit in asking permission, rather than assuming forgiveness, would naturally follow apology represented growth in her understanding of how trust functions and how repair must proceed. I'm willing to see whether you can actually change the patterns that have characterized our relationship. I responded carefully, wanting to be honest about both my willingness to engage and my uncertainty about outcomes. But I need you to understand that I won't tolerate any return to dismissiveness or casual cruelty disguised as humor. If you make comments that minimize my career or suggest that my choices have been misguided, I will address it directly and immediately rather than letting it pass unchallenged as I have in the past. I'm done protecting your comfort at the expense of my own dignity. That's completely fair and appropriate, Vanessa agreed without hesitation. I would expect you to call out any behavior that crosses the boundaries you're establishing. I'm committed to doing better, but I recognize that ingrained patterns sometimes reassert themselves unconsciously. If that happens, I need you to tell me directly rather than withdrawing or assuming I haven't actually changed. Her acknowledgement that lasting change was difficult, and that she might stumble despite good intentions, created realistic framework for moving forward. Transformation of long-established patterns rarely proceeded smoothly without setbacks or regressions. What mattered was whether she responded to feedback by adjusting behavior or by becoming defensive and reverting to old dynamics. We spent the remainder of our time together discussing more practical matters about upcoming family gatherings and how we might navigate those situations differently given the shifts occurring in our relationship. Vanessa suggested that for Thanksgiving, which was several weeks away, we might consider having a direct conversation with our parents together about family dynamics, rather than allowing holiday interaction to proceed according to established uncomfortable patterns. The proposal felt risky but potentially valuable if we could present a united front about needing different treatment going forward. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Vanessa reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture of physical connection that felt unfamiliar after years of maintaining careful distance. "I'm proud of you, Elena. I should have said that decades ago, should have recognized and celebrated what you were building with your life. I'm proud of your service, proud of your accomplishments, proud of the person you've become through the challenges you've faced. Please know that even if I failed to show it for all these years, you have always deserved that recognition and support." The words landed with unexpected force, penetrating defenses I had constructed against needing family validation. I had told myself repeatedly that I did not require their approval or pride, that the respect of fellow service members was sufficient. But hearing Vanessa finally offer the acknowledgement I had unconsciously craved for years created an emotional response that was difficult to contain. Tears I had been carefully controlling throughout the lunch finally escaped, and I found myself unable to speak for several moments. Vanessa moved around the table and embraced me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the physical contact felt genuinely warm rather than perfunctory obligation. We stood together in the restaurant, two sisters who had been shaped by comparison and competition into adversaries, attempting to find our way back towards something that resembled actual family connection. The drive back to my apartment after lunch left me emotionally exhausted but cautiously hopeful about possibilities I had dismissed as unrealistic just days earlier. Vanessa's apology and apparent commitment to change did not erase the accumulated hurt of decades, but they created space for considering whether genuine repair might be possible, if sustained over time with consistent different behavior. The coordination between Vanessa and Marcus around addressing family patterns suggested I might finally have allies willing to challenge dynamics that had gone unchecked throughout my adult life. That evening, as I prepared materials for the next day's meetings at the Pentagon, I found myself reflecting on how much had shifted since the dinner party that had seemed like it would be just another uncomfortable family obligation. The decision to wear my uniform rather than hiding my military identity had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond that single evening. People who had been content with ignorance about my life and work were being forced to confront the reality of who I actually was and what I had accomplished. Family members who had participated in dismissive treatment were being challenged to recognize their behavior and its impact. The outcomes of these confrontations remained uncertain. Vanessa's apology and commitment to change, while meaningful, would need to be tested through time and various situations that might trigger old patterns. Marcus's advocacy with my parents might succeed in shifting their perspective, or might simply create additional family tension, without generating genuine understanding. The upcoming Thanksgiving gathering would provide early indication of whether people could actually behave differently in family contexts where established roles and dynamics exerted powerful pull toward familiar patterns. But regardless of whether family relationships ultimately transformed in the ways I hoped, something fundamental had already changed within me. I had stopped apologizing for my choices and accomplishments, stopped accommodating dismissiveness to maintain false peace, stopped accepting the diminished identity that had been imposed through years of comparison and inadequate recognition. The woman who had walked into Vanessa's dinner party in full military uniform, claiming space and demanding recognition, was not returning to previous patterns of self-minimization, regardless of how others responded. The uniform hanging in my closet represented more than professional achievement or military rank. It symbolized a life built on deliberate choices about service and sacrifice, about leading others and contributing to purposes larger than individual comfort or conventional success. Those choices had cost me things that sometimes generated grief, even as I maintained that the costs were worthwhile given what the work had meant and continued to mean. But the costs were mine, owned and accepted as part of a path I had chosen with full awareness of what I was embracing and what I was releasing. No one else's failure to understand or value that path could diminish its significance. No family member's dismissiveness could retroactively make my service less meaningful, or my accomplishments less real. The recognition I had finally demanded from Vanessa was gratifying, and perhaps healing in ways I had not fully anticipated. But its value lay primarily in forcing honesty about relationship dynamics. Rather than in providing validation, I needed to feel good about my choices. I had built a life of purpose and meaning that stood on its own merits, visible to those with eyes to see it, impervious to those who chose to remain deliberately blind. As sleep finally came that night, I felt the complex mixture of exhaustion and determination that characterized periods of significant life transition. The path forward remained unclear in its specifics, but defined in its essential commitments. I would continue serving with excellence and dedication until the work no longer needed me, or I no longer possessed the capability to contribute effectively. I would maintain the boundaries I had established about acceptable treatment from family members, willing to walk away from relationships that required my diminishment as the price of connection. I would honor the sacrifices I had made by living fully into the identity they had forged, refusing to apologize for becoming someone whose life did not conform to others' limited imagination about what mattered or what success looked like. The military had taught me many things across 2 decades of service, but perhaps the most valuable lesson was about the difference between leadership that demanded compliance and leadership that earned genuine commitment. The former relied on positional authority and formal hierarchy to compel obedience regardless of whether subordinates respected or believed in the leader. The latter built trust through demonstrated competence and character, creating followership that persisted even when formal authority structures were absent. The same principle applied to family relationships and personal identity. I could not force anyone to see me clearly or value my accomplishments appropriately, but I could demonstrate through consistent behavior and clear boundaries what kind of treatment I would accept, and what kind of person I had become through the choices that shaped my life. Whether family members rose to meet those standards or not was ultimately their choice and their loss if they proved incapable of the growth required. The week following my lunch with Vanessa brought unexpected developments that suggested the ripple effects from the dinner party confrontation were extending further through family systems than I had initially anticipated. Marcus followed through on his commitment to speak with my parents, scheduling separate conversations with each of them, rather than attempting a joint discussion that might allow them to reinforce each other's defensive positions. He called me after completing both conversations to debrief what had transpired and prepare me for potential responses I might receive. His conversation with my father had apparently been particularly difficult, confronting someone who prided himself on being a supportive parent with evidence that his support had been conditional and unevenly distributed between his daughters. My father had initially responded with defensiveness, insisting that he had always been proud of both Vanessa and me, that any perceived differential treatment was misinterpretation rather than actual bias. Marcus had persisted, providing specific examples of how my father spoke about Vanessa's legal career with obvious pride and detailed knowledge while referring to my military service in vague, dismissive terms that suggested discomfort or disappointment. The turning point in their conversation had come when Marcus asked my father directly whether he had ever attended any military ceremony or event related to my career, whether he had ever asked substantive questions about my work beyond surface pleasantries, whether he could accurately describe what my current Pentagon assignment involved. The answer to all 3 questions had been negative, and the accumulation of those negatives had apparently penetrated my father's defensive certainty that he had been an equally supportive parent to both daughters. Marcus reported that my father had become quiet and visibly troubled as he recognized the pattern his questions had revealed. The conversation with my mother had taken a different trajectory, as she had been more willing to acknowledge differential treatment, but defended it as natural response to daughters who had made very different life choices. She had explained to Marcus that Vanessa's career was simply easier to understand and celebrate, because it followed a conventional path that their social circle recognized and valued. My military service, while certainly respectable in the abstract, created awkwardness in conversations with friends and colleagues who did not know how to relate to someone whose child had chosen such an unconventional profession. She had apparently expressed frustration that I had never seemed to appreciate how difficult my choices had made things for her in terms of explaining to others what her younger daughter was doing with her life. Marcus had responded to this defense by pointing out that parental support should not be contingent on children choosing paths that were convenient for parents to explain to their social network. He had noted that my mother's framing revealed that she viewed my career primarily through the lens of how it affected her rather than considering what it meant for me or what I had accomplished. The observation had not been well received initially, with my mother becoming defensive about having her parenting questioned by her son-in-law. But Marcus had stood firm, explaining that his motivation was not to attack her, but to help her understand how her approach had damaged her relationship with me, and how it continued to create barriers to genuine family connection. Both conversations had concluded without clear resolution, but with apparent commitment from my parents to reflect on the patterns Marcus had identified. He had been careful not to position himself as mediator or to suggest that simple acknowledgement would be sufficient to repair decades of inadequate support. Instead, he had framed his intervention as providing outside perspective that might help them understand why I had finally reached a breaking point at Vanessa's dinner party, and why meaningful change in family dynamics would require more than superficial adjustments. I listened to Marcus's account of these conversations with mixed feelings, appreciating his willingness to advocate for me, while also feeling uncomfortable with the level of family conflict his intervention had apparently generated. Part of me wanted to protect my parents from criticism, even as I recognized that protection was a form of enabling behavior that allowed harmful patterns to continue unchallenged. The tension between wanting family harmony and needing honest acknowledgement of past harm created internal conflict that had no easy resolution. Several days after Marcus's conversations with my parents, I received a phone call from my father requesting that we meet for breakfast before my workday began. The formality of the request, conducted through a phone call rather than a casual text message, suggested he viewed the conversation as significant and wanted to approach it with appropriate seriousness. I agreed to meet him at a restaurant near the Pentagon, choosing a location that was convenient for me and that avoided the symbolism of meeting on his territory or in spaces associated with family gatherings where established patterns might exert stronger influence. My father arrived at the restaurant looking uncharacteristically uncertain, his usual confident professional demeanor replaced by visible discomfort about the conversation ahead. He had always been someone who projected authority and competence in his career as a financial consultant, someone accustomed to being the expert whose advice was sought and valued. Sitting across from me in a restaurant booth, preparing to discuss his failures as a parent, he appeared diminished in ways that generated both satisfaction and unexpected sympathy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.